The wind carried dust across the main street of Redstone Gulch, sweeping in dry spirals that tapped against the weathered storefronts like impatient fingers. It was late afternoon, the hour when the shadows stretched long and the heat finally began to loosen its grip. Folks moved slow under the weight of the day, shopkeepers closing shutters halfway to keep the low sun from bleaching their goods, ranch hands straggling in from the edges of town, horses stamping in troughs of muddy water that hadn't been changed since morning. And in the middle of it all stood the wide-fronted structure everyone called the Ledger House, though no official sign carried the name. It was simply understood that if you owed something, or if someone claimed you owed something, you ended up there one way or another. Inside, the air smelled of ink, old paper, and something sharper, fear mixed with desperation. People rarely went involuntarily. The ones who did came to settle debts they had no hope of satisfying, to argue fines no one ever won against, or to sign contracts so lopsided they might as well have surrendered their futures on the spot. Still, Redstone Gulch had been built on agreements, land claims, cattle notes, supply loans, and the sort of handshakes that ended men's fortunes as often as they made them. The Ledger House was the heart of all that. Some called it order, others called it a trap. She stood near the back of the room, hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. Her name was Mara Linden, 27 years old, sharp-witted, raised on a tiny cliff-top ranch that had long ago been swallowed by drought. She still carried traces of that life in her posture, proud enough to disguise the tremble in her muscles, careful enough not to give more away than she intended. Dust clung to the hem of her faded blue dress, and her boots, once polished by her father before dances in their old barn, had been resold twice with whatever scraps she could trade for. Even so, she looked like someone who hadn't let the world break her yet. It was that stubbornness that kept her feet planted when she should have run. 3 men leaned against the counter not far from her, all dressed in the deep gray vests worn by the agents of the Ledger House. Their expressions ranged from bored to predatory, the way men looked when they believed all outcomes favored them. The one in charge, Miles Dorian, tapped a heavy ring against the ledger book before him. Each metallic click echoed off the walls. He wasn't tall, but he had the confidence of a man who controlled more than his size suggested. His blonde mustache was impeccably trimmed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Every inch of him signaled that he belonged to the wealthier side of Redstone, the side where the street dust never clung for long. Mara Linden, he said, savoring the weight of her name as though it contained a debt all its own. As I've explained, and as the record confirms, the outstanding balance from your family's ranch must be resolved. You are the sole surviving heir. That makes the obligation yours. I've told you, she answered, voice steady but low, the drought destroyed the last of our crop 4 years ago. The note was supposed to be forgiven in the disaster exception. That exception, Miles said with a thin smile, was revoked 2 months later. You should have known that. I didn't, she replied. I was caring for my father. He was dying. There were more important things than rummaging through legal notices posted on tavern walls. One of the agents chuckled. The sound scraped like gravel. Miles didn't bother to hide his amusement. Ignorance may be unfortunate, he said, but it is not an excuse. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation of invisible cords wrapping around her, pulling her fate toward a path she hadn't chosen. She'd been trying to pay off small pieces of the debt for years, working odd jobs around town, selling what little she had left. But interest rates in Redstone moved like vultures, slow at first, then circling fast once something smelled weak. The past due amount was now more than she could pay in 10 lifetimes. Miles flipped the ledger around so she could see the ink-stained page. As you can observe, your options are limited, he said. The indenture contract is the only reasonable arrangement. You would agree to work under direct assignment of the Ledger House for a 5-year period. Room and board provided. Payment applied entirely toward the debt. At the end of the 5 years, the obligation will be considered settled. A wave of whispers rolled through the room. Everyone knew indenture under the Ledger House was neither fair nor survivable. People entered it under the guise of opportunity and emerged, if they emerged at all, older, sickly, and worn by years of exploitation. The terms were legal only because Miles and the mayor collaborated to keep them legal. Mara drew a slow breath. You're asking for my life. Miles's smile thinned. I'm asking for what is owed. What was never owed, she shot back. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "We can proceed with your signature now," he said, pen poised. "Or I can have the sheriff escort you to a holding room until you agree." "That would be an unfortunate use of your time." The other agents straightened at the mention of the sheriff, their boots scraping against the floorboards. Mara's pulse quickened. She didn't want the sheriff involved, not because she feared him specifically, but because the holding rooms were cold, windowless, and loud with the echoes of those who'd spent nights inside. People came out more afraid of everything, even their own voices. Her throat tightened. She could hear her father's voice from years ago. "Make choices you can live with, Mara. Don't sign away pieces of yourself just to make the world easier for someone else." She'd always taken that to heart, even when life had cornered her. Miles tapped the ring again. "The pen," he said. "Your signature." Silence settled across the Ledger house. A few locals who'd wandered in to watch pretended to examine notices on the wall, though their eyes kept drifting back to her. Mara didn't reach for the pen. "I won't sign away my freedom," she said. "Not today. Not ever." Miles exhaled slowly, as though she'd inconvenienced him. "Sheriff," he called toward the doorway, "if you would step in." But before the sheriff appeared, the front doors swung open with a heavy wooden thud. Sunlight spilled inside, breaking across the room in a sharp, bright line, and dust swirled in the sudden draft. The sound quieted everyone. A tall figure stepped inside, hat brim low, coat trailing dust, boots worn but well cared for. A saddlebag hung over his shoulder, scuffed by travel. His presence cut across the tension like a clean knife, not with violence but with certainty. People recognized him immediately, or rather, they recognized the aura of someone who walked his own road. Outsider. Maybe trouble. Maybe exactly the opposite. He paused just long enough for the doors to swing shut behind him. His gaze swept the room and settled, quietly, without hesitation, on Mara. She felt the attention like a warm light on cold skin. Miles, irritated by the interruption, cleared his throat. "Sir, if you require business with the Ledger House, you'll need to wait until." The stranger didn't look at him. Instead, he stepped farther into the room, boots striking the boards with steady confidence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and even. "I'll take her contract." The words hit the room like a dropped lantern. Mara blinked, stunned. "What?" Miles straightened, eyes narrowing. "And who," he asked, "are you to interfere in this matter?" The stranger tipped his hat back enough for his face to come into clear view. Suntanned skin, faint beard shadow, eyes a deep hazel that held nothing of Redstone's crookedness. "Name's Caleb Ryder," he said. "Passing through. But I heard enough." "You have no legal right," Miles said sharply. "Looks to me," Caleb answered, "like the contract hasn't been signed yet." "Means anyone can negotiate terms." Mara shook her head slightly, bewildered. She had seen him maybe once before, weeks ago at the far end of town, trading for supplies, but she had no connection to him, no history. A stranger stepping between her and the Ledger House was like a miracle, or madness, or both. Miles frowned. "This is not a marketplace. This is an official matter of debt." Caleb's expression didn't change. He walked closer until he stood between Mara and the counter, not shielding her exactly, but anchoring himself as a barrier she hadn't known she could rely on. "Then let's settle it officially," he said. "What's the total debt?" Miles hesitated, his confidence flickering. "The balance is substantial." "How much?" Caleb asked. Miles named a number that caused several of the onlookers to gasp. It was outrageous, absurdly inflated beyond anything remotely fair. Caleb didn't flinch. "You expect one woman to pay that back with 5 years of labor. It's the standard arrangement. It's daylight robbery." Miles' eyes hardened. "You will leave this building," he said. "Now." "No," Caleb replied. The room inhaled collectively. Miles gestured sharply at his agents, who took a few steps forward. Caleb didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his saddlebag and laid 2 heavy coin pouches on the counter. The thud was unmistakable. Even from a distance, people could see the glint of gold inside. "That's the total you quoted," Caleb said. "Paid in full." Mara stared at him in disbelief. "You can't." He glanced at her, not with pity, but with quiet resolve. "You don't owe them your life," he said softly. "Not today." Miles sputtered, stunned. "Where did you? How?" "Doesn't matter," Caleb said. "Debt's settled. Release the claim." Miles stiffened. The agents exchanged nervous glances. The ledger laws were twisted, but even they had limits. If the debt was paid outright, there was no contract to enforce. Mara watched Miles wrestle with calculation and fury. Finally, he snapped the ledger shut with a slam. Very well, he muttered. The debt is cleared. The agents backed down. The hold on her future, the one that had tightened around her throat for years, released in an instant she could hardly process. Caleb stepped back, giving her space. Mara touched her hands to her chest as if checking she was still real. Why? She breathed. Why would you do that for a stranger? Caleb met her gaze, and something flickered there, recognition, though she didn't know why. Because I've seen what happens to people who get caught in systems like this, he said. And I wasn't going to let it happen again. She swallowed hard. Again. The word echoed with a story she didn't know, a past he hadn't shared. But she could feel the truth in it. Miles cleared his throat loudly, furious at being ignored. You've made a mistake, Ryder. This woman is more trouble than she's worth. Caleb didn't so much as glance his way. Then it's a good thing worth isn't what I care about. The sentence seemed to strike Miles like a slap. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more, at least not in front of the crowd. People in the Ledger house began whispering, murmuring, moving. The tension that had held the room hostage finally fractured. The news would spread across Redstone within minutes, the outsider cowboy who walked into the Ledger house and did what no local had dared. Some would call him reckless. Some would call him a fool. Others would call him a man with more courage than sense. But everyone would remember the moment he claimed her freedom, not as ownership, not as possession, but as defiance on her behalf. Mara stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. I don't know how to thank you. You don't owe me thanks, Caleb said. Or anything else. She studied him, unsure what to make of someone who did something so costly for no personal gain. People didn't do things like that. Not for her. Not in Redstone. Not ever. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window panes. The dusty light had shifted to a softer gold, the kind that hinted at approaching dusk. It lit the edges of Caleb's coat, the scuffed handle of the saddlebag, the fine line of exhaustion around his eyes. Come on, he said quietly. You shouldn't stay here. Mara glanced once more at Miles, whose glare promised trouble later. But Caleb was right, she needed to leave. She stepped out from behind the counter area, her footsteps lighter than they had been in years. Together they walked toward the doors. Every eye followed them, some hopeful, some stunned, some calculating. Mara had the eerie sense that this moment would change the shape of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Just before they stepped outside, Caleb paused. One thing, he said. She looked up at him. Yes, I'm headed out of town soon, he said. You're welcome to walk with me until you figure out your next step. Or you can stay here and take back what's yours. Either way, you're free to choose. No one should tell you otherwise. For a moment she couldn't speak. Freedom, real freedom, tasted strange on her tongue, like a word she'd forgotten. But the warmth of it spread through her chest. I'll choose, she said softly. Just, maybe not alone. Caleb nodded once, a quiet understanding. And together, they stepped into the blinding amber light of a new dusk, leaving the Ledger house, and the chains that had almost bound her, behind.